I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here at Black Power Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, very happy to be your host. For more on this show and work related to it, check the show description below. Please make sure you like, share, subscribe, support the platform, Patreon in particular, if at all possible, blackpowermedia.org. Put this in your socials. Don't be stingy. Share it with other folks. You know what to do. So I did see a little bit of the skirmish around comedian Amy Schumer coming out and doing what many defenders of Israel have been doing for a long time, which is making reference to something Dr. King is said to have said, or that he in fact did say, largely in defense of the state of Israel, and using that as a way to remind people that even if you're involved in Black liberation, or you're concerned about other communities, or if you need an example of why you should look past the Palestinians and their suffering to support Israel and Zionism and its occupation, here's an example of Dr. King himself. As is, I think, intended in the message to speak to Black people, here is your shining civil rights superstar. And he's even saying Israel has a right to exist, support Israel, condemning anti-Semitism, and so on and so on and so on. Of course, most of the people who do this, as I continue to say, Dr. King is the most known and least understood human in the history of the world, second maybe only to the historical Jesus Christ. And as a result, he is referenced as much as anyone, and with as little understanding or context as anyone. So it just so happens that because, shout out to Geechee and the Barter and Build Collective, where I'm studying with them, a book titled Black Power in Palestine, Transnational Countries of Color, in which the author Michael FISCHBACH has a chapter on Dr. King. Chapter 4, in fact. So I thought we'd take a few minutes, have a look at the chapter, see what context it adds, and take advantage of this moment to remind folks that, again, King is far more radical he's given credit for. Please check the many other programs we've done on that issue. Or as we often want to tell people when it comes to Dr. King,
you just don't read, beloved.
All right, so let's get into it. All right, so here's the chapter in question, chapter 4, Balanced and Guarded, Martin Luther King Jr. on the Arab-Israeli tightrope. And where they start off, or where the author starts off with this, is to talk about how King grappled, at least in his own mind, to the extent he didn't do it publicly, and in his inner circles, with the occupation of Palestine and having to juxtapose a need to remain nonviolent in his philosophy and approach, to defend Jews and Israel, and particularly Jews supporting his efforts in the civil rights struggle, and also to balance the emerging radicalism in the Black community, the Black Power movement, and his own consciousness. So despite what Amy Schumer and many others have wanted to try to do with Dr. King, it's way more complicated than, of course, they would be wanting to give credit, or want to acknowledge, certainly not wanting to concern themselves with the complexities of Black people's history and thought. But as he's quoted here as saying that there were dark days before, but this is the darkest. And of course, what Dr. King was talking about was the 1967 Arab-Israeli war, or conflict, or invasion, or so. A lot of this chapter focuses on King's struggle with whether he should go for another visit, because in 1959 or 1957, I'll check that in a second, he had actually gone to the West Bank as part of a trip. And I think it's the first time I'll come back to it in the article, but one of the few times, if not the first time, someone of his stature in civil rights made such a visit to the West Bank. But that, as he noted here, he said, but when it came to going again, as he had been planning to before the breakout of that 1967 war, He said that he didn't think he could make that visit and not come out unscathed. Because as this article points out, and as many might want to particularly the reverse hashtag community that wants to make use of King in reference to some vacuous call for getting a reparations check. The reality is that King was an internationalist, and it is correct here, for the most part, as Fischbach writes, that King simply did King did not simply champion the struggle of American blacks. He also spoke out against war, poverty, and injustice more generally. In particular, he watched events in Africa, Asia, and Latin America as anti-colonial struggles broke out left and right in the 1950s and 60s. He called for a boycott of the racist regime in South Africa, and in December of 1957, he gave a speech in which he acknowledged the interconnectedness of global struggles for independence, with that being waged by blacks in America. Quote, the determination of Negro Americans to win freedom from all forms of oppression springs from the same deep longing that motivates oppressed peoples all over the world. The rumblings of discontent in Asia and Africa are expressions of a quest for freedom and human dignity by people who have long been the victims of colonialism and imperialism, end quote. So again, when people start to project what King would be saying about this conflict or other conflicts, he was clearly laying out a political trajectory well before he was assassinated. And in fact, some would argue, probably myself included, that this is in part what led to that assassination. Contrary to what generally is written about King, he was not a knee-jerk supporter of Israel to the detriment of Palestinians and other Arabs. So, of course, King, being a preacher, being steeped in sort of that tradition and mythology, like many, he saw connections between his ministry and the plight and suffering of the ancient Hebrews, and I would argue mistakenly applied that mythology to an understanding of literal history, and then misapplied that misunderstanding to the literal history of today's European descended Jews and Israelis. But the point being, this is one of the pulls on King. These traditions, these mythologies. Then there's the political pull of needing support from American Jews for the civil rights movement, or feeling that he needed this support, which is, of course, an ongoing major contradiction. And then the other pull of Black militancy and radicalism. So, as I said, the book talks about this chapter talks about King making a trip to the West Bank in 1959, feeling it necessary, even as part of his again nonviolent ministry, and it marked the first time that a major figure in the Black freedom struggle actually visited the Palestinians' homeland. So, again, whatever people might want to say, trying to ascribe their politics to King, he felt it necessary to meet with and show solidarity with Palestinians. The chapter goes into a discussion of him meeting with Palestinians and displaced Palestinian people and what impact this had on him, having dinner with displaced people no longer able to live in their homes. And when he came back, the chapter talks about the impact of the trip on his subsequent sermons. A walk through the Holy Land. He may have been including the Middle East when he spoke these words about the third world and struggles of its people, words that were also relevant to the Black Americans sitting in the pews before him. I think we know today there is a struggle, a desperate struggle going on in this world. Two-thirds of the people of the world are colored people. They have been dominated politically, exploited economically, trampled over and humiliated. There is a struggle on the part of these people to gain freedom and human dignity. So again, it's truly disrespectful, even to the extent that some of these arguments are correct, to reduce King and others to a platitude here or there that is politically convenient, when so much of the context is left out, and an appreciation for the people in the study, in the history of the people being discussed, in this case Black people or Palestinians, is largely irrelevant. In October of 1964, for example, he received a letter from an American living in Israel who brought to his attention Israel's discriminatory policies towards Palestinian minority, This American Jew made the comparison himself between Israel and South Africa, trying to help King better understand. And in fact, if you read this article for yourself, of course, I would not article, the chapter of this book yourself, American Jew living in Israel spoke similarly to the experience that was passed down to me about my own mother's people, that they had been invited to this sort of socialist kibbutzim style in Israel, and then they realized that Zionism was a colonial project displacing and oppressing Palestinians, and they weren't down for it. My mother's folks ended up leaving well before Israel was created. This particular American Jew stayed, but still noted what was happening and wanted King to be aware of it. And then the chapter, I'm not going to do too much with this. The chapter goes into the backs and forth that King had about trying to determine whether or not he would go visit the Middle East again. He ultimately does not go, because he does not want to be seen as being supportive of the oppression of Palestinians by Israelis, while he's also trying to connect the struggle of Black people to anti-colonial movements around the world. But he also doesn't want to be too explicit about this because he doesn't want to upset the support of American Jews whose support was often sought by King and the mainstream civil rights activist community. So ultimately, King does cancel all of those subsequent trips and is assassinated before he can ever go back. One point that Schumer and many others would not want to bring up is the fact that a lot of King's conflict internally around support for Israel or lack thereof was the result was a culmination of his increasing radicalism that was sort of signified in the famous or infamous, from the perspective of the state, 1967 Riverside Church speech, A Time to Break the Silence, where he condemns the U.S. war in Vietnam. He condemns colonial imposition of all kinds, and is seen increasingly as a threat to national security by the state. But this also begins to inform how King looks at the state of Israel. Now, this is one part of the chapter that really struck my interest because of my ever increasing focus and critique of Black capitalism and its messaging. And I thought this was very interesting because King's strategy to try to walk that tightrope, as this chapter is describing, was to defend Israel's right to exist, but condemn the economic oppression that it imposed on the Palestinian and Arab community. As the chapter says here, King therefore chose to balance his public assertion of Israel's right to exist with an indirect acknowledgement of the Arab point of view, but in economic, not political terms. He chose to speak about how poverty and the lack of economic development in the Arab world kept the pot of violence and war boiling, and eschewed any overt discussion of the political basis of Arab grievances such as Palestinian dispossession, the fate of the 1948 refugees, compensation for their property losses, and so forth. So as I noted when reading this, here King reverses his argument for Black people and avoids the reality of political power. This is an acknowledgement that focus on economics, quote unquote Palestinian capitalism, is a concession to power and is itself not real power at all. Because as I've talked about extensively with King and the claim that King spoke explicitly against concepts of Black buying power and Black banking and Black capitalism, saying that billions of federal investment would need to be required, and political power and redistribution would all be essential if Black people were to ever be free or equal, et cetera. But because he's walking this tightrope, he does what is now done to us today. You can almost get away with couching the problems exclusively along the terms of economics if you're not talking about it in the context of colonialism, capitalism, and exploitation in that way. And you're simply saying if we address their poverty and address some of this gap in inequality, we can lessen the horrors. And that way, in that way, the tightrope we're asked to walk today and that pundits are inviting us to walk today is to say, I know black people are suffering, but I'm not going to advocate that they organize for political power. I'm just going to say, get your money right. And that's what King was saying to the Palestinians then. And in this case, he was wrong. But I just thought that was wild that he reverses himself when talking about Palestinians because he knows full well in terms of black people that that's not going to work. But he also knows, and as this chapter points out, that the removal of the occupation is not really on the table. So to walk the line while having to say Israel has a right to exist, we just need to lessen the violence and the oppression of Palestinians. He can get away with that, or he hoped he could get away with that, but it's insufficient. And see, because he does say here, and this is something again the Amy Schumers of the world won't want to quote. And this is speaking in June of 1967. King says, I think for the ultimate peace and security of the situation, it will probably be necessary for Israel to give up this conquered territory.
Message!
Because to hold on to it will only exacerbate the tensions and deepen the bitterness of the Arabs. These were prescient words indeed. And it's interesting, this chapter is pointing out that that part was a comment that came when he was, quote, pressed to comment about whether Israel should return the Arab territories it occupied during the war. King was forced to get off message and go beyond the palatable platitudes to answer that specific political question. And again, I love the way it's written, that this is the political question that King wanted to avoid. But when pressed, he said, unlike what Amy Schumer and others would often want to quote and would be left out of the video clips, et cetera, that would be circulated by pro-Israel Zionists, et cetera, and so forth, is that King said you probably have to give up the conquered territory if you want to stop the violence. That's the political question. You can't just encourage some reduction in the gap of material inequality or income or wealth. You can't just tell Palestinians to circulate their dollar or to start a business. That's not going to work. That's not the issue. You have to come up off that territory. But as the chapter goes on, it really does make clear that King never really elevated politically to the level of those on his left, namely Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael. He doesn't. He comes into conflict with what's described here as the SNCC newsletter controversy, which was ultimately condemning Israel and Zionism as racism and colonialism and siding with the Palestinians and recognizing that Palestinians were colonized like black people here and that their struggles were identical or similar, if not identical. And then this enormous array of Jewish organizations all reached out, including the Anti-Defamation League, all reached out to King by telegram shortly after the conference ended. The 1967 National Conference for New Politics in Chicago dropped a statement condemning Israel and Zionism, starting the June War. King had spoken at the beginning of that conference, didn't apparently realize how radical it was going to end up being, and then was called to condemn them and to separate himself from the rest of them, distance himself from the gathering because of the statement on Israel, again, as being Zionist and colonialist. Richard Russell, a Jewish businessman, activist, and part owner of Ramparts magazine. Russell was close to King and occupied a seat in the executive board of the National Conference for New Politics. He indicated that he was resigning from the committee because he had tried and failed to have a fellow board member, Stokely Carmichael, removed. King adopted this suggestion, one coming from Stanley Levinson, his confidant and sometimes co-author. King adopted this suggestion almost verbatim. That is the suggestion that he say that Israel's right to exist as a state and its security is incontestable. So King did reconfirm that Israel has a right to exist. And what is described here is his two-pronged approach that is two-pronged approach trying to balance support for Israel with a recognition that the roots of the problem lay in the region's economic underdevelopment. That was the hustle, as I'm calling it. But again, it's a lot more nuanced than Amy Schumer would want to say, and of course, and others. And it leaves all of them leave out King's increasing radicalism elsewhere. But on this issue, he had not been given the chance to properly evolve politically. I would argue it's clear to me where he was headed, but you can see the forces aligned to inhibit it. So King did, that is, offer up a statement on behalf of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, uh, stating that Israel's right to exist as a state is insecurity is incontestable. At the same time, the great powers have the obligation to recognize the Arab world is in a state of imposed poverty and backwardness, and that this must threaten peace and harmony. So the chapter talks a little bit about this being part of Andy Young's plan as well, to as a statesman to again avoid the political, make note of the reality of the imposed poverty. But if you're not demanding Israel give up territory, or if you're not demanding or challenging Israel's right to exist, or not challenging its occupation or settler colonial status, uh, there is no upending the imposed poverty. So this is just to me a shortcoming in King's approach. But as the chapter does say here, rather than simply blaming each side, especially the Arabs, for intransigence or fanaticism, the statement instead offered a left-wing sounding economic analysis by noting that at the heart of the problem are oil interests. The SCLC statement condemned anti Semitism firmly and clearly. SCLC will continue tirelessly to condemn racism, whether its form is white supremacy or anti Semitism. King knew the issue was going to get worse. He noted that Israel's use of military power to subdue the Arabs was no solution, a point Amy Schumer and others would leave out. So, again, even if you want to quote him as supporting the existence of Israel and condemning anti Semitism, he was also condemning the violent oppression and imposed poverty of Palestinians. But he did separate himself from Black Power advocates. He did separate himself, and according to this, took swipes at Black nationalists and their vision of racial solidarity with the Third World by stating that such people were color consumed and see a kind of mystique in being colored. But he did acknowledge the plight of the Arab community and sought to have them brought into the conversation, where he would end up saying peace for Israel means security. On the other hand, we must see that peace for Arabs means in a real sense of security on another level. Peace for the Arabs means the kind of economic security that they do so desperately need. These nations, as you know, are part of that third world of hunger, disease, of illiteracy. I think that as long as these conditions exist, there will be tensions, there will be endless quests to find scapegoats. 10 days later, King was dead. So there you have it. Definitely don't want to stop there. Please definitely check out the book and that chapter in particular. And I just wanted to point out very in as short a way as possible that obviously when it comes to Dr. King, much of the context and nuance is left out. Many people, particularly these times and with these issues being the subject, are not interested in the context or the nuance, particularly as it comes to Black and Palestinian people, and are just looking to make largely abusive use of those histories. So wherever King's shortcomings were politically, he was at least much more left and uh, critically engaged than he's given credit for, certainly by the Amy Schumer types. So just wanted to point that out very quickly and encourage people to check it out for themselves and continue the conversation beyond here, obviously. And then finally, whatever King's or anyone else's shortcomings are, we don't have to be stuck there, and we don't have to be stopped at that point. We can move farther to the left and continue to evolve our radical critiques, analyses, and militancy to the point where we're freeing Palestine, freeing the land, freeing all political prisoners, and finding peace, as Fred Hampton used to say, even if we have to fight for it. So peace, everybody. Catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like and throughout the Black Power Media platform.